The United States Wrongful Involvement by Braxton Teschendorf and Dolan Brisk.
After the Cold War, the fight to contain communism was alive. NATO was pushing countries to resist communism and implementing propaganda to oppose the beliefs of communism among citizens. When Ho Chi Minh asked the U.S. to help Vietnam get its independence from France, the U.S. declined because they feared it would spread communism. America believed that if Vietnam were allowed to fall, the domino theory would take place in the rest of Southeast Asia, ultimately influencing the U.S. to back France in the war.
All right, thesis. Some would argue the U.S. needed to get involved in the Vietnam War to contain the spread of communism. However, because America decided to start the war, the fading public support of American involvement, and the lack of preparation for the U.S. troops, the United States had no place to fight in the war.
Main idea 1, fading public support. Media involvement in Vietnam War. American citizens prior to the Vietnamese War trusted the American government and thought no harm could be done by our government. However, distrust grew in the Vietnamese War due to numerous reasons. One major reason was from the media's involvement in the war. With large coverage of what was happening in the war being broadcasted on television, many American citizens' eyes were open to the cruelty of war. The action of the media capturing the war brought the citizens to America to oppose the Vietnam War.
College protests. With the American involvement in Vietnam, many people wanted their voices to be heard. Of those many people were the large rise to student involvement in activism. Thousands of students marched on campuses protesting Presidents Nixon and Johnson, the draft, and just the general involvement in the Vietnam War. Students felt obligated to take action and oppose the draft because it directly targeted young men, many of whom had been in colleges and were now required to register for the draft. Students were also very engulfed in the media and thought the idea of being sent to a losing war was terrifying and pointless.
Lots of spending and deaths. Arguably the most impactful reason for the public to oppose the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War was the gruesome number of deaths and large amounts of U.S. spending. The United States was estimated to have spent around $176 billion. All while the American economy was going through great inflation, causing many citizens to financially struggle. However, the public encourage rose from the approximate 582,200 deaths. The idea of fighting in the war with many dying and lots of money being spent put many Americans at unease and ultimately led to a lack of public support in the Vietnam War.
Main idea number 2. The U.S. was underprepared to fight. And among that, the 3 examples are unfamiliar weather conditions, guerrilla warfare in Agent Orange, and the Viet Cong disguises. Unfamiliar weather conditions. Many U.S. troops were sent into Vietnam, but the U.S. disregarded the tropical and humid climate Vietnam had to offer. Many struggles arose from the monsoon weather, thick jungle, and rough terrain, mosquitoes carrying diseases, and extreme heat. These conditions served as intense impediments to the American soldiers. The numerous amounts of unfamiliar condition goes to show how unprepared America truly was.
Guerrilla warfare in Agent Orange. Furthermore, many American troops were unprepared for the type of war they were getting themselves involved in. The Vietnamese fighters used the tactics of guerrilla warfare. The Vietnamese would use surprise attacks, hit and run maneuvers, booby traps, and an elaborate series of tunnel systems to throw the American soldiers off track and ambush them. Another disadvantage the Americans faced were side effects caused by herbicides. Agent Orange. Agent Orange would lead to numerous people becoming sick and sometimes later developing cancer or infertility.
Viet Cong disguises. One final thing the U.S. wasn't prepared for in the fighting against Vietnam was that the people they were fighting were disguised as civilians. The Viet Cong wore clothing that was typical for civilians to wear. This actions left the U.S. troops susceptible to ambushes because they hadn't suspected civilians to attack. The U.S. also wouldn't kill random civilians out of suspicion. All these variables caused the U.S. to be underprepared in their efforts to fight against Vietnam.
Main idea number 3. The U.S. was blamed for starting the war. With the Pentagon Papers, the U.S. allied with France in the Gulf of Tonkin. Pentagon Papers. After the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the public showing the lies told by the American government during the Vietnam War, they exposed President Nixon many precise numbers of deaths and money spent during the war, and original plans to invade Vietnam previous to the Gulf of Tonkin. These papers grew distrust in the government, but more importantly, they exposed how the U.S. was to blame for creating a conflict and starting the war.
The U.S. backed France. In 1941, Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh declared independence from France. Vietnam reached out to the U.S. because they had gone through similar circumstances in their road to claim independence. However, the U.S. declined helping Ho Chi Minh because of the idea of containment. Instead of helping Vietnam, the U.S. funded and aided in helping France try and take control of Vietnam. This action shows how the U.S. was once again responsible for starting the war.
Gulf of Tonkin. Leading up to the Vietnam War, the United States had a naval ship located in the Gulf of Tonkin to collect information on North Vietnam. However, in early August, it was speculated that North Vietnamese ship fired at a U.S. ship, even though the U.S. ship had no damage done to it. On August 24th, a storm occurred, and it was said that the U.S. naval ship had been approached and required authorization to take firmer action from the U.S. Congress. Congress gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to greatly escalate the U.S.'s military's direct involvement in Vietnam, marking the beginning of the U.S. heavy involvement in Vietnam. This once again can be used to show how the U.S. was responsible for creating a war with Vietnam.
The big takeaway: America was fighting in the war to prevent the domino theory from taking place, but that action led to many problems. That could have been avoided had the U.S. stayed out of the Vietnam War. Among those problems was the fading public support, the underpreparedness of the U.S., and the responsibility for creating a war with Vietnam. Because of these problems, the U.S. lost countless lives and loss of money. This marked the first war ever lost by the U.S., and it could have been easily prevented.